Welcome back to Political Economy, the second part of the lecture that we weren't able to finish on the past Thursday. So in this part of the lecture, we're going to start with a review of what is political economy, and then talk about that tension between is media, the culture industry, or the public sphere coming out of the Frankfurt School. So first, as a reminder, political economy is an approach that analyzes power relationships, especially between politics and economics. And it looks at their relationship and their mediation, i.e. how they interact and intersect with another. So a scholar who takes a political economy approach is interested in how money is made through media, how media is governed, how media is controlled, and who is kind of behind that. We talked about some of the key assumptions that a political economist comes with, and that is first is that a political economist sees that, if you want to study media or any other area of life, economy can't be separated from political and cultural life. That economic foundations often influence kind of what we see as valuable, what we see as desirable, what we, who has the say or voice in a certain culture or context. And that's why they look at politics and economics together. Secondly, the political economist, especially in the approach to media, understands that media has power, and this power requires mapping the shifts between who or what systems are in control of this influence. Now, this gets especially challenging when we look outside a national context and look at an international context. So what kind of organizations, what kind of corporations hold the power? And we talked about in class how our world is shrinking in terms of its influence, not just in American media, but just only very few corporations hold kind of power and having their hands in multiple global contexts, which means that we need to kind of pay attention to those entities, how they treat their workers, and what kind of influence they have on what is cultural production. And finally, media power is based on assumptions around class-based power. So we talked about, using the example of the movie Enola Holmes, about how this idea was emerging, trying to challenge the class-based society, the idea that you're born into a certain strata society, whether it be the aristocrats and people who owned land and had money, and everyone else was at the bottom of the economic food chain and didn't have much of a voice to say in culture. Political economists are trying to say that actually if people are empowered and we look at different ways to divide society, we can actually give the people, the masses, and look at them in a positive light as part of the production of culture and not just people to be sold to or people that are the receivers of culture and information from the media. So then we turn to looking at one branch of political economy studies, the Frankfurt School. This is where a lot of the ideology about political economy emerged. And remember, we talked about this was a group of scholars that were coming out of Frankfurt, Germany. They had gone through World War II, and they'd seen the influence of fascist Germany, especially the government's role in propaganda. And they also were looking at how scholars in other parts of the world, especially in North America, were studying propaganda, but focused mostly on how the messages of propaganda influence audiences. And they said, no, we need to look at actually who is producing the propaganda and how that kind of went about, what stories they were trying to communicate, and how that influenced the culture so much. So they're trying to question the idea of politics, power, and economics, and look at it in an interdisciplinary approach. And this becomes important because we then shift our focus to just the media messages or the media texts that are produced to the media system owners, systems, and workers, and how that controls and shapes society. So in the Frankfurt School, we talked about kind of some of the important scholars, and I kind of set up this dichotomy where we talked about some of the early scholars of in the Frankfurt School saw media in a very negative light. And it was very understandable. They had just seen how the propaganda of World War II and the government machine and political and media machines behind the Nazi Party had kind of basically shaped people's view of the world that was inaccurate. I remember talking to a friend in Germany, and he talking to his grandparents and saying that, after World War II ended and, the Allies came in and they began to tell people what had happened, they're like, well, that's not what we saw on the television. That's not what we heard in the posters. We heard that we were winning the war. We heard that this is what's happening. And so we saw the power of media. And so they had a very kind of negative view of the media. And Adorno and Horkheimer coined this term, the culture industry, that we'll talk about. But we also talked about Jürgen Habermas, a student of Adorno, and how he said that, well, media is very powerful, but we could actually see it as not just a tool of mass deception with propaganda, it could be an agent of change. And so he began to explore what would the conditions need to be, and so that media workers and individuals could gather and use the media to voice their opinion, to change society. And we have this image of the kind of the person kind of in the city park, kind of teaching or talking, lecturing about their viewpoint, and seeing the public square as a place of kind of giving diversity of opinions versus just saying, just buy into the hegemony of the common idea. So let's talk about a little bit more what this idea of the culture industry is. So we've kind of talked about the concept of industry, with Enola Holmes, we talked about the matchstick girls, and we talked about factories, and factories are where you produce a product, and usually it's a single product, and there's a production process where people do a certain steps along the line to produce that one product. And, the aim of kind of producing, and especially from the Industrial Revolution, is let's get these products standardized, packaged, and then get them distributed to the people so we can make the most money. So, a kind of industry or a factory produced products are kind of seen as they're uniform, they're standardized, there's a set process. And so if we put that, this is kind of the idea that Adorno and Horkheimer are working with when they come up with this term, talking about the media as the culture industry. This emerges from a book they called Enlightenment as Mass Deception. So you can kind of see they are talking about media as mass deception. And they saw that, kind of what is happening in a factory with producing products, that media and information through, World War II have become this product. This idea, let's carefully package these things, produce them in a certain way, distribute, put them in certain containers, and then uniformly show people how to get them and consume them. And so this kind of assembly line idea. So when they're saying culture, the media is a culture industry, they're arguing that the media is producing culture, is producing ideas and texts through this assembly line. And they believe that the manufacture process manufactures messages of false consciousness, i.e., this is a constructed process. It's not just like going and picking an apple off the tree and then that is your message. No, it's like taking that apple and shining it up, making it look nicer than you are, maybe even spraying a little coloring on it so it looks brighter. It's about changing the message. It's manufacturing, reshaping the message. And the culture industry, this kind of concept is they began to talk about how these production processes, especially if they're influenced by kind of government policy or an ideology that's being pushed forth or a corporation, that this creates this kind of process that, again, what people have called introduce hegemony, where people are kind of more willing to accept these standardized messages. But a well-known quote from Adorno, he says, technology of the culture industry confines itself to standardization and mass production and sacrifice what once distinguished the logic of the work from that of society. So instead of kind of taking a piece of art and just saying, this is, look at these technique and these details, we're going to reproduce it in a way so that everyone has access to it, but it's kind of an edited version. And we see kind of in this image down here, these women, they're working in this kind of, factory, there's kind of sewing and stuff, but what they're doing is they're producing culture in this very standardized way. And so this is again, a very kind of, this shows the pervasiveness of media coming in culture, but also the kind of this kind of very, very well crafted and very structured view. So how does this kind of influence us today, or what does this concept look like today? Well, we live in a world where, we can kind of, go to a famous art museum in Paris, France, and then we can buy our favorite artwork on a t-shirt, buy a postcard and send it to a friend. We can download it as a screensaver onto our computer. That more and more media products have become standardized, and especially the idea is that, well, if it's standardized, not only can we sell it to more people in our community, in our local community, but in our nation and globally. And so they say that, media is more and more is focused on kind of creating a product that can be sold, that can be distributed freely. That goes into the very intention of creating products. And they say that that doesn't just frame how you create maybe a picture or the kind of material that you put into kind of creating that popular culture figurine or whatnot, but it's also into the kind of message. And so the argument is that global popular culture is kind of fueled by this culture industry. It's more about kind of selling your TV show, your music globally, and that often gets into the way songs are edited. Producers produce albums of the kind of even covers or images they associate with this. And so this creates this agency gets traded for hegemony. What they're arguing is that even the people who are trying to create unique products, they're basically for the almighty dollar or the almighty euro. They're willing to give up some of that freedom, some of that creativity for consumer hegemony because they want to sell. And so what this has led to is that even kind of what we've seen is that even like messages would be seen as alternative, pushing into culture, or maybe even disruptive, are even still being kind of repackaged by the media. Take for this example in the bottom corner, this is a picture of Che Guevara. He was a revolutionary in Cuba, and he believed in the communist ideology, and he wanted to bring communism to Cuba. Communism in its base sense was based on socialism, so it has some positive ideals about how economics can be shared amongst workers, and it's about kind of having a more equal or egalitarian system. And so he thought this was a good thing. So, but in his process of kind of helping transform from aristocratic hierarchy based society to a communist society, he did a lot of things that were highly problematic. He killed intellectuals and artists that were standing in the way of his beliefs or ideology. He kind of destroyed a lot of the kind of natural historic buildings and whatnot of Cuba in the revolution. So he's kind of seen as this kind of controversial character. But over the last 30 to 50 years, we've seen his image kind of be associated as kind of a revolutionary. And so in that kind of things, you'll see Che Guevara's picture on T-shirts, on on banners, and he's being used as a symbol of someone who's fighting for what he believes in. Someone he's resisting what the culture is saying and trying to go for what a new way of thinking. But that new way of thinking, some people could question: was that communist ideology and what happened to Cuba afterwards, was that really worth it? Was the kind of the slaughtering of the intellectuals to be able to take over the university, was that really worth it? So this is described as the idea of we can even like the media can use kind of individuals as icons, create an alternative message. And this was obviously done because, if we do this, he's then become an icon that people then adapt by and affiliate with. And he becomes a marketable product unto himself. That image has become famous around the world. And many people don't actually know the true story of who Che Guevara was, both the good and a lot of the bad. So this is what we see is that, in the culture industry today, it's very much about incorporating audience preferences into products. So we see that kind of this, it comes in not just how people are sold, but how we actually have become products. We live in a social media world where we're constantly putting information about ourselves freely online about our gender, our beliefs, our maybe where we live, or maybe what our preferences are, and that is seen as marketable information. So political economists will look today and look at kind of what kind of data are people freely putting out there. What do they see as they're getting for that? And how is that data being used by corporations then to sell content back to us? The whole process of data mining is a huge industry unto itself around the world. And we often don't see this as a way of kind of, corporations then leveraging that information to sell us more products of what we like, and even changing the shape of how we see the world and what we kind of desire. So again, culture industry presents a very kind of negative view of the media about its influence in society, about how it kind of tends toward deception, about how it tends to kind of manipulate not just consumers, but people who create the media as they become part of the system. So we kind of see, media, it presents a very negative view of the media. And this is kind of where some of the roots are of this assumption that media are bad, media are deceptive, media are controlling, comes from this kind of image of media as a culture industry, just producing standardized messages that don't have nuance, that don't have the true story behind them. And obviously, there's a lot, there is truth to this, and can name many examples that kind of fit this bill. But we also can see that Habermas said, well, in this world of media, yeah, he can be used for negative, but if it's also leveraged can it also be leveraged for positive? And if we actually empower people, how might the media be seen differently? He was going back to kind of his training from Adorno and his training about Marxism. And Marx was saying, hey, let's kind of see society in multiple levels, not just in two, but he introduced a third level, which doesn't sound very radical. But in that kind of cultural context, the idea of let's look at the bourgeois and the people who are creating products, controlling products, and kind of making money, and to what extent are those workers that are helping in the process, are they being used, or are they being empowered? And he said that, if we take that kind of viewpoint and see and create an environment where not just the media workers, but the audience is empowered and can make choices, we could create what he called the public sphere. So the public sphere is a place where, what he argued, is when people get together and the state or, the government come together, and a space is created where they can meet, they can share, and they're on equal footing. And so use this term, the public sphere, as a place where private citizens engage in critical, political, public debate, and they form culture. And what he found is, especially, he's writing in the kind of 50s and 60s, he's found that, the newspaper, the editorial page, is one of these places where people are able to meet, that, anyone who, anyone can send a letter of the editor to then the newspaper, and they usually pick the best articles to be read. And he was arguing that kind of, especially in television journalism was doing more work of trying to interview, everyday men and women in their stories, trying to give an alternate view. And so he said, began to see in kind of, the mid to late 20th century, that mass media played this role of maybe creating the public sphere. It does it by identifying a range of voices. And so, he saw that media, didn't just give one viewpoint like we see in propaganda. They at least tried to give an A and B, two viewpoints. Now we can debate kind of, who those viewpoints are, but they were trying to kind of show a range of voices. And he said the public sphere, the media, allows people to do that, when the reporter, by the people that they pick, the people they go to. He also saw that the media and mass media was helping frame public opinion. And he was writing during a time where a lot of studies were coming up about kind of news and how news was being influential in shaping people's views of different candidates in elections, about how different policies and how they voted. And so he saw that media could be used to sway or influence public speaking. So this public sphere, if the media is allowing people into that space, both the kind of the people who are producing the media and then people who are willing to come in and speak their voice, the media could be turned into this place of equality, a place of where multiple voices are heard, where that encourage diversity rather than sameness. So rather than the media being a culture industry, actually it could create the alternative. So that it could be a place where diversity and richness were encouraged and created, whether that was in the form of information in a news article, or even just the idea of popular culture and people producing art and folk art as a way of a kind of expressing and resisting maybe some of these more manufactured images, narratives, and the like. So the public sphere, this is when the internet came out and back in the mid 1990s, many people, especially in the first 5 to 10 years, felt like, wow, this actually might be the physical manifestation of what Jürgen Habermas was really talking about. The internet, it basically anyone with technical skills and access can make a website. And then later with the birth of kind of social media platforms, anyone with access can get on there and, not just, have their own account and gather their own friends, but they can share their ideas and their opinions. The reaction button plus kind of, leaving comments became very important. People kind of exerting their opinion. And so the media, today we see that the internet definitely does create spaces for the public sphere to emerge. And many scholars have written about how the internet is this great place that can encourage activism and can create actually places of, again, to resist that packaging of resistance, to push back against those narratives. But one thing Habermas found in his later writings, and I would have the privilege of hearing him a couple decades ago at a conference. That he said that we have all this potential. We have he lived to see the internet and its workings, and he said um, the reality of the public sphere is that it has this potential, but is the internet used for public discourse and culture creating? Is it creating new content, ideas, alternative viewpoints, or is this just reproducing ideas and culture consuming? So one of the huge challenges that while the internet does create alternatives, it also has a lot of tools built into it to kind of remix and recirculate culture, i.e., that nice share function, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram or social media, where you can kind of share somebody else's post and comment on it. So you didn't produce that post, but again gets associated with you, and you get to reinterpret it. This idea of kind of reproducing or reinterpreting people's ideas is more related to consuming culture rather than creating. And so, he kind of came down to the public sphere. It has the potential to create culture, but unfortunately, what I'm seeing is a lot of people using it to consume culture and not use it to have a voice. They're using it more for infotainment rather than engagement. So, this kind of raises the question, if they were saying, the positive side of the media is that it gives us the potential to share ideas, and especially digital media gives even more resources to media audiences as well as workers. But we also are kind of torn in this thing where there is a sense of this kind of reproduction and remixing of sameness. So let's think of Facebook, as an example. Facebook is a very popular media. Even though I know a lot of young people don't use it anymore, it's still the most popular social media platform around the world. So is Facebook, is it a culture industry or a public sphere? Well, we definitely could cite examples about how Facebook has been used as a public sphere. And I'm pointing to a picture. This is a kind of famous picture from Italy. It's about a place where the philosophers would gather, they would share and debate ideas. And here we kind of see, like in a digital age, that would be like the thumbs up and liking and sharing of ideas and engaging. We see this kind of place of diversity. So Facebook has been very powerful in not just kind of empowering kind of people to critique government, played a role in the Arab Spring of about a decade and a half ago, where people began in the Middle East began to protest against issues in their government, in Egypt and Tunisia and places like that. And they used social media like Facebook to kind of talk about what they were unhappy about and even to organize demonstrations. So we can see Facebook definitely is a media that allows people to get together and share diversity of opinion, even against the kind of people, the powers, the political and economic powers. But we also know is the way that Facebook is designed, that there's been a lot of kind of controversy in the last 5 years. Even Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Facebook, was brought before Congress and testified, and we found out that they were doing a lot more data mining of users of Facebook's information than we thought, and that they're selling that to the people, the highest bidder. And so here, at the same time, the media being a public sphere, it is also empowering this culture industry. And this is the challenge of what scholars try to look at, to what extent, is the media a culture industry or public sphere? Well, the answer is yes to both. And that's one of the complicated things. It's easy to vilify and treat media as one entity, but we know that there's multiple venues and sources and outlets, and it can do both. It depends on the audience, it depends on the user, it depends on the corporations that control it. So they in the book, in Global Media Studies, the authors kind of point out that looking at political economy and how it's been studied by media scholars, they give kind of three versions of political economy studies. They said, political economy 1.0, starting with kind of the Frankfurt School, they were really focused on how the media manufactures consent. How does the media produce messages that get you to agree with them? Whether those are messages coming from the government or from a corporation to say, buy our product, or some other ideology. And so us media scholars were focused on how media owners and corporations how they get their power, how they maintain their power, and how they use their power, and especially for corporate interest. In the political economy 2.0, they talk about this kind of emerges they talk about in the introduction as well, emerges kind of in the late, mid to late 20th century, where they said, well, and just like with the voice of Habermas, media can create the public sphere, that we can look at these corporate powers as empowering a negative messages or control, but we can also see as a media, either consciously or unconsciously, giving us space of freedom. And so here, the media economists tried to come up with a more powerful view of like, well, how do media structures empower the public with agency? Remember that word agency means the ability to act, the ability to make choices, the ability to design or redesign or critique things. And so they began to say, if we study maybe how media is being used positively and how it can be used, maybe that can be a source of kind of reforming. And we think about, again, this is all these authors are writing about global media, looking at the global, that media was kind of basically had a lot of control influence by the global north, but the tools, especially of digital media, were beginning to empower the global south as well. And so that they could have a voice and a new level that they didn't have, and even have an international voice. And so the authors kind of go to kind of looking at political economy in this kind of current era, where it was this both a digital era and an era of mass media. It's an era where we see kind of, again, corporations having to intersect and interact with each other. And they describe, they would argue that this kind of current age of political economy media studies is what they call critical political economy. And this is kind of approach that was really developed in North America. And they're kind of saying that we affiliate with this. And so instead of just looking at owners and corporations, they're really looking at media as a system. And so they approach the media system as a system to look at, okay, kind of not just, let's not just say it's the government or the corporations, but what sectors, what workers, what kind of processes or policies have been put into place that thus control the media or cause it to either be a culture industry or give room and encourage it maybe to be the public sphere. And so it focuses on especially media management and workers, how they make choices or can make choices, and how what power and influence they have. So kind of really focusing on a very specific group of the kind of media production and distribution process, which is kind of really important. So just a couple more closing remarks on critical political economy before we move on. So critical political economy, we'll pick up a lot of this, in the weeks to come. But one of the key aims of this kind of version of critical political economy that Toby Miller and Marwan Crady are advocating is that this version of study, it goes beyond just criticizing or critiquing global capitalism. So they said a lot of political economy was basically pointing fingers at, because the media is a lot of it has come out of the U.S. and the U.S. is based on a capitalist system. So media systems tend to form these kind of transnational corporations and function in a capitalist system. We're saying few people should have control, and the rest of us kind of, well, tough luck because the market wasn't friendly to us. They're saying, well, that just critiquing that's not helpful in the long run. They're saying what we need to do is not just critique this, critique the power that the Disney Corporation has, critique government control or intervention by policies to kind of get their message out, but explore and suggest what they call emancipatory politics that empowers workers and communities. So we see the tie-in to political economy 3.0. They're saying that we need to look at kind of what are the conditions of media workers, in what ways is our policies or procedures in, whether it's a news agency, whether it's in a film production company, what extent do they have choices and ability to kind of question or critique? In what ways are they able to take the media and then in their own hands and leverage it to get an alternative viewpoint put out there? And how are these messages affecting global communities, not just local and global communities? So, one of the key issues that, critical political economists are looking at and question that they talk about in the book is this just idea of, the digital sphere and digital technologies. Is the internet culture industry, or is it a public sphere? And there's been a lot of talk, in the last 20 years about the idea of the prosumer. The prosumer is the putting together the word producer and consumer. And the early arguments, especially in the 2000s by media scholars, were often that we're in this really new phase of media because people don't just consume media anymore. They're not just the audience, that digital tools and the internet gives them access to production capabilities. So that is producer consumer. So at the same time as they're consuming media, they're also able to produce alternatives. And this can puts media in a much more positive light because it becomes a tool and not just a kind of message to be thrown at you. But the concern was, again, looking at the internet, is the internet, is it really producing consumers? And just because we have the ability to create our own alternative radio station to kind of blog about and critique or talk about kind of things in society, do we really do that? Or are we actually becoming, these are words I made up, the Westumers or the Wosumers, the Westumers or the Wosumers. Westumer is the idea that people are a worker and a customer at the same time, or a worker and a consumer. So this ties into a quote off from page 42, and where Crady and Miller say, in a cybertarian world of free intermediaries, everyone and no one is producer in the traditional quasi-institutional sense, just as everyone is simultaneously an unpaid worker and a paying customer. So what are they saying right there? Well, first, the idea of the cybertarian world is kind of a very idealistic world of a world that's free, that anyone can do what they want. And we know, not everyone has equal access, not everyone has equal skills. So the internet is definitely not an equal world, even though it touts itself to be. But they say that, no one is a producer in the traditional sense. A traditional producer would be someone who has kind of the resources to build like their own media company, and it would be independent. We obviously have the ability, we can create our own virtual newspaper or our radio station, but we don't have control over those devices. We're kind of using those devices, but they're owned by somebody else. They're designed by somebody else. And so we are subject to those kind of constraints. Also, like we can start our own radio station, but if the power gets cut or our Wi-Fi service doesn't like the content we're producing, they can go in and actually cut off our subscription. And so it's not the kind of power level that we've seen in traditional production. There is a sense of we are producers that have more dependencies than old school mass media producers. But they also are arguing that everyone is simultaneously an unpaid worker and a customer. Now, remember I said a couple classes ago that said, if you don't pay for it on the internet, that means because you're the product. People say, well, I have the ability to speak because I can go on Facebook, I can go on Twitter/X, I can go on Instagram, I can create, my identity or the beliefs that I want to expose. But at the same time that you are producing content, you're producing that content for free. And are you making any money off of it? Well, there are places that you can monetize it, but generally speaking, somebody else is making money off of your free content. So you, in one sense, you're not just paying for access to the internet and access to that thing, but you're also basically giving stuff. You are the product. Your information, your data is being sold, whether it's what you produce, like from an Instagram post that then gets going virally and other people can use it for commercial purposes, or just that sharing your information that then goes into the data mining process and sold to companies to kind of get the profile of what the average university student is and wants in terms of media products. And so we see that kind of political economy is trying to question kind of some of these overly optimistic assumptions. They're not willing to give up that the media can't be a public sphere, but they're also realizing that that line between being freely accessible and empowering people and controlling people is a very thin line, and oftentimes it's a very careful counterbalance. And only by looking at workers, looking at kind of media production systems, can we really tell and look at what are the conditions that can encourage, whether it's the empowered public sphere or the disempowered culture industry. Well, I've talked a lot, and so I want to kind of come to a summary of kind of what I want to be your takeaways on this second half of the unit on political economy. So just a reminder, political economy, it examines issues of media ownership and control and how that influences media messages. So it's looking at not just like, let's watch the movie and what is the story behind it, but how was it the script that they chose, the director that they chose, the investors in the film and the advertisers around that, how does that control the message? and the media owners. So looking at that. We talked about the Frankfurt School, which is, kind of was a one influential school of political economy and also influential to Miller and Crady. They studied media and society, but looking at it, is media an agent of as an agent of change in the public sphere, or does the media primarily manufacture consent and encourage hegemony? And this is kind of this tug of war that we see both. And the authors of this book are taking kind of a critical political economy approach, kind of from this. And they're saying that, okay, we want to, in this tradition, we need to question who owns and who controls the role of government, role of ownership and influence. But we're going to take it down to the systems kind of level and looking at kind of especially workers and issues of equality in especially a global media context. And some of their main aims are to question the immediate power of corporations. So looking at in a global world, what influence are they having and how do they create media systems, intentionally, unintentionally? They're trying to also question capitalist economic models, looking at, if media companies are mostly, based on that kind of model and money-making kind of outlook, how does that influence what the news we read, the freedoms we have, what we consider truth? And then mostly it all boils down to this issue of we want to look at workers and systems because we want to look at the inequalities that globalization has created. And if the global north is so dependent on the global south, shouldn't there be a little bit more give and take? Shouldn't there be a little bit more equity, especially when it comes to kind of controlling who gets to tell the stories of different parts of the world and different people? So these are important things to keep in mind as we begin to look at kind of specific examples of kind of media corporations at work.